WQX web rules. So there are a lot of rules for WQX and schema rules, but these are the most common ones that we see with data files, and I would like to say about that we come across. Anybody feel free to counter that if you think that percentage is off a little bit, but we'll get, sorry, I saw a message pop up. Anyway, WQX web rules. Analytical methods and context and the metadata associated with it. So if you're sending your data to a lab, an analytical method associated with that analysis. So they also have a context. So the context is who came up with the method that your lab is using and what method are they using. So this is important for the reuser to compare it to their database, their data sets, and whether or not it's comparable for their analyses. And we always want those two things to be captured in separate fields. So analytical method needs to be in one field, context needs to be in another. So for example, you have your result analytical method as 903, and the person who came up with that method is the US EPA. Or for phosphorus, for example, you might have RA05, and then obviously the same context as US EPA. You can usually find this information on your lab PDFs, hopefully not PDFs, but within your lab information from them.
And just a reminder, folks, this is one thing that would be very helpful for you to populate prior to the March 5th meeting, so that this is taken care of, and it'll make the import configuration and submission much easier.
Absolutely. Here's another common WQX data rule that we come across are detection conditions and result values. So the way we capture it in WQX, if you have a result, we capture it as the result, but if you do not have a result, so for example something was not detected or below detection condition limit, we put that in a different field. So those are captured at two different levels. So if you don't have a numeric value for a result value field, you need to populate your result detection condition field. And then in that condition you say, why don't I have a result value? You say it was not reported, it was above quantitation limit, below quantitation limit, etc. But then you also have to add, but you never have both fields ever, because it will fail 100% of the time. But you want to also populate these other conditional fields based on not having a result value and populating the detection condition, such as you can see here that with nitrate, the result was 0.49 milligrams per liter, and that's all we had to report. But if you had copper, and copper does not have a result measure, your result detection condition is why don't you have a result measure for copper? It's because it wasn't detected. So what is the quantitation limit? Well, the lower reporting limit is 0.005 milligrams per liter. So you need to populate that information so that people can say, you know, why was it not reported, or why was it below detection condition? So maybe somebody can use that number on their analyses. Another portion of it is activities, mainly our activity ID. So an activity is anything that you sampled at the same day, same time, on the same site, and the same activity type using the same equipment and such. So it's all an activity. And this is the lowest unit of unique measurement that we have in WQX. So everything in that set of samples, as you might want to call it, your activity, is tied to one activity ID. That activity ID is how you update, delete, or add new data to WQX. It's where everything is logged under. And to develop an activity ID, you obviously put in your site information. So you would put in RA05, that was a method earlier, but say that's the site, you would put in R805, you would put in your date, say it was today's date with the time, and then it was an activity ID type of a field measure observation, so I used a probe to do that. So you just make this activity ID using the formula. So if you see the formula down here, we usually use concatenation formulas for that. Excel is really good at this. You can do this in databases as well, but if you use this function to generate your activity IDs, you shouldn't have an issue down the road of duplicating activity IDs and therefore overriding old files. So, but like I said, activity IDs are the lowest unique values that we have, and so if you submit them again because you didn't generate them unique to the date, time, activity type, etc., you'll override your old data and therefore not have as much data as you were anticipating. Or if you created new ones with the same data, you'll add new data to your data sets. So, for example, you thought you changed the date. You changed the date because you thought it was today and it was actually yesterday. Well, your activity ID, your original one that you did submit, will need to be removed because it's the same data associated with the activity ID. I may have gone in a little over a depth on that one, but we can go over that at some point. But this concatenation formula is what you might really want to take away from here is activity IDs are one of the most difficult parts to generate, but we're giving you the answer right here. So concatenate M3, so your cells might be a little different. But this is a way to say, take the information from my cell M3, put in a colon, and then put in my date here, and then also put in my time, etc. So just a surefire way of getting it right. Okay, and then identifying activity types. So earlier I said that activity types, certain activity types need an analytical method, such as something that you send to a lab. You got to figure out why. So, for example, field measure observations are temperature readings, something you do with a probe, but your lab readings are sample routines, or you collected something for QA, QC purposes. So you really want to document that within your data set. And if you want to see all the different activity types that we'll have, you can always go to this lookup. But we really want to document that for reuse purposes within the data. And these are more examples of those. So like I said, the sample routine is that lab sample, but they also did a lab duplicate to do a QA, QC on their lab. If something's missing, we can usually add these, but we ask you to look at the existing activity types before suggesting new ones. Okay, so as Charles had said before, we need you to identify your analytical methods and your context. But we would also like, while you're doing that, it's easy to find the sample fraction or, the method specification for this information. So the sample fraction will be on that data form, whether it's total phosphorus or, doesn't exist, but dissolved, or dissolved phosphorus. So that's really important, and with somebody who's reusing that data to do analysis as well. So this is an important part, and we have characteristics that require that sample fraction. So your data will be kicked out if it has a sample fraction association with the characteristics. You can always find it in our characteristic list names within the domains. I think this is the last setup, but one of the last WQX rules is that we need your data to match with WQX allowable values. Earlier I said the activity types to look them up and we can add new ones. Well, this works similarly to that. So there is a list that WQX checks your data against and says, oh, this doesn't match the list perfectly. We don't accept it. So certain fields have allowable values, such as characteristics such as pH, dissolved oxygen. But people can capture allowable values very different. So I'll steal Charles's example, as he always uses the one about lead. So lead could be lowercase l, E-A-D, could be capital L, E-A-D, or it could be P-B. But those are three different ways in which capturing lead, and one is only accepted by Storet. It's a capital L, E-A-D, I believe. But we have a characteristic list in which it has to match perfectly. And there are two ways to make your data match perfectly. You change it in your data set. So you either change all your phosphorus to exactly how we have it in our system, or if you're using WQX Web, we can put those translations into your import configuration so that every time WQX sees PB, it converts it to lead as we accept it. another thing that we can work through in the import configurations, but it is something to be very aware of when you're going through your data sets. If you want to see the domain values, all those values that WQX checks against, you can go to this domain values link here. So overall, data organization is key to avoid issues further down the road, whether it could be a cloud database or locally hosted database. Avoid combining fields that will create invalid column formats for importing into WQX Web, or you'll have to divide them to get them in anyway. And once you decide on an appropriate spreadsheet format, consult with your laboratory or to request that they report your data in the preferred format.